Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to On the Middle East, where we explore the big and interesting developments in the region. My name is Amrin Zaman, and my guest today is Meghan Bodette, who is the research director of the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington. Meghan has recently returned from Kurdish-led northeast Syria, where she spoke to top officials and many ordinary people. Kurdish leaders are in talks with Damascus to integrate their administration and armed forces with the interim government. However, things are bumpy as the sides fail to see eye to eye on the shape of future governance in the country. The Kurds want a decentralized system. Damascus objects. The bloody events in Druze majority Sueda last June appear to have shifted the balance in favor of the Kurds, at least for the time being. Meghan unpacks the dynamics for us. Welcome to our program, Meghan.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you've recently returned from northeast Syria, where you spent more than a month, right?
In total, yes.
So tell us a bit about the mood there. How do people feel, especially after the violence in Sueda? That must have been very unsettling for people because the expectation was that, it's going to be us next.
Absolutely. I think what's important to understand is that at first there is a sense of hope and security that in some ways didn't exist before, that has been dampened by the tragedies we've seen in Sueda. Since the announcement from Abdullah Öcalan that the PKK would disarm and some of the subsequent steps in this nascent peace process in Turkey, as you've reported on extensively, one of the real concrete moves forward is that there's been a fragile de facto ceasefire in northeast Syria, and seeing people able to move around more freely, not afraid that they might simply be, driving in the wrong car, visiting the wrong shop, or at a meeting with the wrong political figure, that sense of freedom from the drone war, the knowledge that infrastructure won't be destroyed and could even be repaired, had really created a sense of peace and stability that people were quite optimistic about. And yet, visiting in August, after the events in Sueda, and also after having visited in June, just after the PKK's announcement that it would dissolve, when those ceasefire conditions were materializing, the difference is very stark. People do believe, as you said, that they will be next if there is a reassertion of government control of the Northeast. And when you look at particularly the incorporation of groups that are under US sanctions for abuses against Kurds, religious minorities, and women into the army, the fact that it's these groups and also foreign jihadists, much like those that joined ISIS, that are at the forefront of some of these attacks, the risk of tribal mobilization, all of these factors coming together leave people very concerned that if they don't get some kind of decentralization and if they're no longer able to defend themselves and secure their own communities, that they will face a similar fate to what happened in Sueda, and a similar fate to what has happened to Kurdish people when governments have reasserted centralizing control over Kurdish regions throughout the past century, whether that's the failure of the peace process in Turkey, the failure of the 1970 Iraqi Kurdish autonomy agreement, or the consolidation of the Islamic Republic in Iran. So they're very recent fears with deep historical roots.
But it's also the case, isn't it, that at the same time, the administration in northeast Syria and the Syrian Democratic Forces are also feeling in some ways empowered by what happened in Sueda, because what we now see is that Sueda is effectively no longer under the central government's control, that Israel's intervention proved, a sort of seminal moment, I'd say, and that they see opportunities for themselves as well, and that in some ways their bargaining position has been bolstered by those events, however tragic they may be. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I think that their strength in negotiation has always come from the fact that they have a legitimate social base that not only positively believes in their project, but also negatively faces real risks from any other system of government. And I think what we saw in Soweto galvanized that social base. People who I know who would have been very critical of the administration a year ago when I spent a couple months in between Iraqi Kurdistan and Northeast Syria have fully rallied around the flag. There's a sort of consolidation of the community that's been strengthened. So that certainly happened. And I think also the impact on the regional and international balances has sort of further vindicated another source of strength of the administration, which has been their rather outsized international partnerships. We saw, and you reported yourself, that prior to the Soweto events, there was a lot of rhetoric coming out, certainly of the United States, and many concrete steps taken by many actors to bring Syria back into the fold. And while that's still ongoing, and I think that it's perfectly reasonable for the international community to seek to work with Syria's new authorities, the violence in Soweto has shown that this new state's centralized vision and its ways and means, its tactics, its methodology of achieving centralization are antithetical to the type of stability and security that is the basis of the international engagement with Syria. If we look at what regional states and countries like the US want, they want a counter-ISIS partner, they want a Syria that won't threaten its neighbors, they want opportunities for economic investment. And when you have a group of tribal militias and semi-incorporated Turkish-backed factions and foreign jihadists attacking civilians, being called off but not fully called off by state authority, you have questions about who has the monopoly on violence there. That doesn't paint the picture of stability that the international community wants. Whereas in Northeast Syria, where you have quite a bit more order and stability, look, in Qamishlo, I can walk home, to my apartment from my friend's apartment after midnight by myself. That's something I wouldn't do in Washington, D.C. There is real stability and security in the Northeast. And I think seeing how that broke down when the government attempted to assert its centralized vision certainly strengthened the case that the path to security and stability in Syria, particularly on the question of the Northeast, is through a negotiating settlement, that preserves decentralization and that realistically allows the people who've been keeping Qamishlo and Derik and Kobani safe and secure for the past 10 years to continue doing what they were doing, which was working.
But, we heard the US envoy to Syria, Tom Barak, speak very firmly, unequivocally against federalism early on. But then after Soweto, we noticed a shift. And in your conversations with Syrian Kurdish leaders, have you been told that, yes, there indeed is a shift in the US position now, and that they are more open to decentralization to the extent that we can assume that Tom Barak represents the administration's views on such matters?
I think that, the American shift speaks for itself. As you said, before Soweto, Ambassador Barak was speaking very harshly against federalism. After the violence in Soweto, he walked back that rhetoric quite a bit. And I think that fundamentally the sort of political system that is going to be created in Syria is not necessarily, in the hands of the US to support or oppose. I also think from my conversations with people who are involved in discussions around those negotiations, what they stress is that federalism is one form of decentralization. There are many types of decentralized system that could be created. that, could be federal in nature, could be unitary in nature, looking at things like devolved power, could involve greater powers going to, local and regional levels of government. So one thing that was stressed to me is that decentralization is a very broad concept. And, if you look at the Kurdish position on federalism, we see this is something that the autonomous administration wasn't originally asking for. It came into their negotiating position through the Kurdish unity dialogue with the Kurdistan National Council. And then even Iraqi Kurdish leaders who support the KNC and who enjoy a federal region of their own have been very forthright about saying, look, this is the system that we have in our region, but it might not be the case that, Northeast Syria will be exactly like our system, because Northeast Syria is a different political and geographic and historical context. So I think that what's important is that, there is an understanding now that full centralization, a return to pre-2011 is going to be impossible to implement without massive destabilizing violence. And that the way in which the Northeast will be incorporated into the new state will be by means of negotiation and cooperation, not by military.
But do you think that that is now the clear American position on these matters?
Based on what I can see in the conversations that I have, I do think that the American position is that they want a negotiated settlement. I don't think that they have a view either way on the details. I think they want something that's going to work. And when you look at the realities politically, militarily, and in terms of the perspectives of communities in the region, I think that reality is going to force some type of decentralized system.
I agree with you, but of course there is the fact that the United States has troops on the ground in northeast Syria, which is quite vital, I think, to the sense of security in the region. I think ordinary Kurdish people feel reassured by their presence, correct? And that's kind of the leverage. And it was leverage that Barak seemed to be hinting the United States might use, saying, we won't be there forever, we're not your nanny, using that kind of language. Is it your feeling, based on your conversations with people who are in decision-making positions, officials, senior officials, is it your understanding that now that kind of pressure has also been relieved?
Well, I think that the United States saw the consequences of a precipitous withdrawal in 2019 with the invasion and occupation of Serikani and Tel Abyad. And since then, as you've reported on, as we've covered at the Kurdish Peace Institute, as anyone listening to this probably knows, following the 2019 withdrawal, not only did the US subsequently retain troops in Syria and reach a ceasefire in Turkey, we also saw behind the scenes a shift in US posture on the wider Turkish-Kurdish issue. There started to be claims of that we reported on in 2023, US involvement in suggesting a partial PKK ceasefire, which they did end up declaring prior to the 2023 elections. We saw in 2022, for the first time, then Biden administration defense officials say that there was not a military solution to Turkey's conflicts in Iraq and Syria. We saw even former US officials, who had been serving in the Trump administration at the time of the Serikani war, saying that, if they were in office now, they would be supporting a peace process between Turkey and the PKK. I believe Joel Rayburn said that to Ruda at some point, during the Biden administration. He had been a top official on Syria during the time of the incursion. So we saw all of these shifts, that there was a sort of bipartisan consensus towards this idea that a unilateral withdrawal without a diplomatic solution was not in US interests in 2019. It's likely still wouldn't be if it were to happen again in a way that precipitates a conflict. And I think the US understands that to get to a political solution that will allow US troops to withdraw without a destabilizing conflict that could reinvigorate ISIS, give opportunity to actors like Iran, you need to get to some kind of understanding between Turkey, the Kurds, and now, of course, the new Syrian government. So I do think that the US is now in a position where this is something that they understand.
And what about the other stakeholders? We also see that there are countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, who are also kind of in the mix now. It's become a much more complex diplomatic environment. And do you find that the administration there is able to navigate this new environment in a way that advances their own interests? Is there a maturing, let's say, of the administration in that respect?
I think that they've always been able to, so to speak, play a bad hand very well. I think that something that is a really crucial part of the history of all of this, of how we got to this moment in time where, this group that was once a collection of, young people with Kalashnikovs now negotiating for an equal stake in Syria's future. Part of how they did do that was the ability to engage with the international community. But one of the challenges that the administration faced, at that same time of going from this hyper-local community-based entity to a group that had to negotiate with actors like the US and Russia, was a sort of, lack of diplomacy capacity due to not having to carry out that kind of diplomacy, at any point in its history. And I think when we look at particularly the past 5 to 10 years, we see a very rapid increase in diplomatic maturity, and in being able to speak to all sides, to make the case, to reach out. You mentioned the Arab states. I think we've seen that General Mazloum Abdi has been doing significantly more Arabic language media. Those interviews have gone very viral on social media. People love them. Generated a lot of interest, generated a lot of negative interest as well, which still drives publicity. But, I think this is symbolic of, a sort of ever improving public diplomacy strategy, a state to state or state to non-state, I suppose, diplomacy strategy.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
So, given the Kurds' experience and connections, do the rest of Syria's minorities, or components, shall I say, look upon them as the best place to argue their case with Damascus and the international community? And does the central government feel threatened by this?
The transitional government in Syria, as well as the government of Turkey, in their reaction to this unity of peoples and components. I love that they say components and not minorities. This is, naturally, I believe in Kurdish and Arabic, the term that you would use would translate more to component. And you find actually a lot of people say that they like that phrasing because, it puts everyone on equal footing, right? It doesn't say minorities and majorities. It says we're all components of the same larger whole. But anyway, they have this conference of unity of peoples and components, where they brought in not just speakers from, different Kurdish, Arab, Syriac, Yazidi, political and social groups in the Northeast, but they also brought in Druze and Alawite notable figures, to give messages to that conference. And immediately following this, the transitional government called off their participation, in the Paris negotiations, something you had been reporting on very closely. And the statement that they made, from Damascus, you read it and you read, this has been Google translated from Turkish and, given to someone in Syria to say, they talk about the schemes of Kandil. This is not Syrian political discourse, right? This is very much adopted from longstanding, Turkish political discourse. And I think the fact that these actors were threatened by this conference, which was a peaceful event, people got up, they made speeches. If you've been to any of these meetings or conferences that the Kurdish political movement puts on, the most dangerous thing that happens is you're sitting there for an hour, the speech hasn't stopped yet, you're thinking, am I ever going to get out of here, right? This is a completely peaceful event. They do many of these conferences on a regular basis, but this one got this very harsh reaction because I think it proved that many Syrians who are not Kurds, are not supporters of necessarily the brand of politics of something like the PYD, aren't sort of the traditional constituency of the SDF and the autonomous administration, still see it as representing an alternative to the kind of hyper-sectarian, Sunni Islamist hardline governance that is emerging out of Damascus. And I think that's very important. I think that's also part of what's giving them, renewed credibility and legitimacy in those negotiations. They do represent an alternative vision for the country.
But Arab nationalism nonetheless remains a very potent force. And, historically, there's always been this sort of tension between the Kurds and the Arabs. And that's, goes beyond what we're talking about right now, has very deep roots. And how you overcome that is, of course, also hugely important and would absolutely need to be supported by any government in Damascus if you really want to fix it, right? If you want to sort of build bridges between the communities, I mean, what's happening in in northeast Syria, I don't think suffices, does it, to sort of overcome those prejudices. And so you still need to work with a government, with a central government, with the state, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think all parties need to ultimately, come together, and if they want Syria to be, one united country, which is something that the SDF and Damascus have agreed that they want, then you need a state structure and a national identity that are expansive enough to include every different ethnic and religious component, different political opinions, differences in every aspect. And this is something that's difficult to do, right? Around the world, we see that this is not something that has been done perfectly anywhere. There are struggles towards a better system in this regard going on, everywhere that we look. But I think that it is very important, for any new government to succeed in Syria, that it represent all citizens, that it recognize, instead of trying to paper over differences, to acknowledge them, to see this as a source of strength, to undo the injustices, imposed on certain communities by the previous regime. I think that while people come at this from different political perspectives, and while they might support, different actors as the best path of getting there, these are things that most people want. And I think realistically, Syrian Kurds are giving the state a huge benefit of the doubt in this regard. The state of Syria has never really been a state for its Kurdish citizens. You've had, on one level, an authoritarian state, oppressing everybody as subjects of a dictatorship. And then the specific denial of the Kurdish language and identity, the removal of citizenship from many Syrian Kurds, this sort of, identity-based persecution, the economic de-development of the Northeast. All of these factors have left it so that, in 2011, when this began, many Syrian Kurds, didn't see Syria as a state, as something that represented them. And then this was only reinforced over the course of the conflict, when both the regime and the opposition, sometimes seemed to be in a competition of who could be the most anti-Kurdish. There was never any real outreach to what the Syrian Kurdish community wanted. Look in Kobani in 2014, when ISIS had the city under siege, people believed that if it reached the city and reached the people, that they would all be killed or abducted, like it happened in Shengal just months before. it wasn't Syrians from Idlib or Damascus coming to defend Kobani. It was Kurds from Diyarbakir and Dersim and Jizre and Mahabad and Hawler. You know, if you look at the military cemetery in Kobani and you see the birthplaces of the people who gave their lives fighting for that city, it is people from other parts of, you know, the area that Kurds call Kurdistan that are now within the borders of Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, as well as many Syrian Kurds, you know, people defending their home. These past 10, 15 years, we've seen time and time again that when the Northeast is under attack, you know, it is Kurds from other Kurdish regions that come to their defense. And it has been, unfortunately, a certain type of Sunni Islamist or nationalist, oftentimes Turkish-backed, you know, groups that have been attacking them. You know, and the new state, I think, had some opportunities to undo some of this, but unfortunately, it's, you know, reiterating some of these patterns. They have not recognized Kurdish as an official language, despite promising in writing in the March 10th agreement to grant Kurds constitutional rights. They've integrated Turkey-backed Syrian National Army militias that were under US sanctions for abuses against Kurds and women into the new army, you know, given them positions of power. They are signaling in policy that they see their Kurdish citizens as second-class citizens. And all of the rhetoric about inclusivity, you know, that was coming out at the beginning, many people feel that that doesn't mean much if the policy decisions are exclusive. And then, of course, on the autonomous administration side, you have areas where they can improve as well. You know, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the way that the situation in places like Deir ez-Zor has been handled. You know, that has had, I think, some unfortunate outcomes. There are, you know, we could talk all day about what has been going wrong. But at the end of the day, you know, if you're going to say, look, we're a state, we're not a militia, we're not one armed actor among many, we are the government of the state of Syria, then you need to behave like a state. You need to give rights to your citizens.
You
can't
mentioned
do
Deir
this.
ez-Zor and things that went wrong there. Could you give us some examples of how the SDF has not managed Deir ez-Zor as well as it might have?
Well, I think, you know, we saw a few years ago with the defections from the Deir ez-Zor Military Council and some of the tribal fighting that took place there. You know, this is the outcome of a policy where, you know, the fight against ISIS expanded very quickly. It was important to the US and the coalition, you know, to go into these areas. And I think, you know, it shows, ironically, that the Northeast Syria's system, you know, the flaws are when they're not implementing the principles that they try to implement best. You know, you didn't have the best delegation of, you know, decentralized power in that area. You had some delegation of power to individuals, you know, who later ended up, you know, as we saw in the 2023 clashes, defecting and, you know, causing some conflict. You know, you have, again, this sort of deep-seated mistrust between, you know, Arabs and Kurds that, you know, led to, I think, issues on both sides. So, again, you have an example of a situation that is kind of brought into being by this third-party interest, you know, of the coalition wanting the SDF to take this campaign against ISIS there. You have, you know, challenges in the difference between that community and the sort of community that formed the basis of the SDF. I mean, this is an area where there were protests because the SDF curriculum, you know, talks about the equality of women and religious minorities, where there's been challenges in implementing, you know, things like the co-chair system, getting women to participate. You have a very different, you know, cultural outlook. And, you know, you have instances where the SDF tried to handle the situation in a much more centralized way than its sort of ideas and principles would have dictated that it would. And this is going to cause conflict anywhere if you have people who are dissatisfied, you know, in a government that's not necessarily delegating
So doesn't
power.
it make sense really for the central government to take over those areas, being that the
Well,
majority
my free
aren't?
policy idea, you know, for any of the negotiators, if they're listening, is that I think it could be a quite fair trade for as a test of working together on the future system of decentralized Syria, the transitional government goes into areas like Deir ez-Zor, and the autonomous administration and its internal security go into areas that are Kurdish, that are now under alleged transitional government control, like Afrin. I think that, you have many complaints from Arabs saying, why are this, Kurdish-led SDF present in Arab areas? You have Kurds who say, why is this, Islamist-dominated, Arab-dominated transitional government present in, areas like Afrin? And, again, I think that there are many obstacles to this. Chiefly, I doubt that Turkey would ever allow it. We are seeing reports of a Turkish withdrawal from Afrin. I think that these sort of contested areas, that are not the chief constituency of either actor, that have ended up sort of in these hands due to these dynamics of the conflict, could be places where, they could work together in a way that would really benefit, I think, the people in most of these regions. If there's popular support in a place like Deir ez-Zor for the transitional government to come in, and there's popular support in a place like Afrin for the autonomous administration to come in, why not use these sort of mismatches as a test case of how you can work together, to build your future decentralized system? I don't believe that this is the most realistic idea in the world, but I think that it's something that could be considered if there were certain outside obstacles that were dealt with.
Well, you mentioned Turkey, of course. Turkey is incredibly important, and you seem to suggest that Turkey has quite a bit of agency over the Syrian government, but this is a matter of increasing debate. We do know that, for example, Turkey has been putting quite a bit of pressure on the interim government to join in some kind of military action against the SDF. To pressure it into abiding with the March 10 agreement as it interprets it. And Shara seems to be resisting. So, I mean, the dynamics are quite complex, aren't they, ultimately? Because I've also heard you say, for example, that if things don't go well with Damascus, well, then maybe the Syrian Kurds would be better off somehow joining Turkey in some shape or form. So, there's so many contradictions here because on the one hand, Turkey is also trying to fix its own Kurdish problem, and may end up doing more for the Kurds than Damascus would ever be willing to, or vice versa, if, reality imposes itself on Damascus in ways that it is no longer able to resist. And, the international stakeholders basically say, you either do it this way or, just forget about any support from us. So what would be your final thoughts with regard to how this all plays out between Turkey, Damascus, the Kurds?
Well, at the end of the day, they say politics is the art of the possible. And the reality is, for all of the criticisms you might make of any actor, for all of the possibilities of what might happen in the future, this is an incredible moment of possibility for the Kurdish people, for Syria, and for Turkey as well. As you said, there are negotiations going on in both countries. Turkey has a lot of agency in Syria. It's also very much constrained in some ways in Syria by what it might want to do to resolve its own Kurdish problem, within its own borders. Syria, on the one hand, is in many ways economically and militarily quite dependent on Turkey, but it's also an actor with its own interests. You look at the government's sort of focus on bringing in investment, for example, diversifying. It can't necessarily do that if there's a raging civil war in the Northeast, right? Which is a difference with, what Turkey might be willing to risk. And then again, the Kurdish political leaders have options. These cross-border ties are very close. I don't think I know anyone in Kamishlo who doesn't have, some extended family on the other side of the border in Nusaybin. And the reality is that looking at cross-border connections for possibilities of where the better deal might be, Perhaps, this time last year, it would have sounded very unrealistic. Perhaps this time next year, we'll be talking about, the new expanded Nusaybin city boundaries and their new, Dem party MPs. I don't know. But I think the point is that, Bashar al-Assad, a brutal dictator, is gone. Whether Damascus has realized this yet or not, his style of running a state, based on this sort of ultra-nationalist, ultra-centralized model, that's gone too. Turkey has realized that it has to make some concessions to its Kurdish population, however much it might not want to. The PKK has realized that, in the 21st century, this sort of 20th century style protracted people's war isn't necessarily going to bring any kind of outcome, that they're better off as a political actor. This is a time for real opportunity and change, in all three of these areas. And so my prediction, I think that based on the conversations that I've been having, people are realistic about the threat of conflict. I do not think that Syria's conflict in northeast Syria is in the ultimate interests of any party. It would harm the peace process. It could restart civil war in Syria, which both SDF and the transitional government would like to avoid, I believe. It's certainly not in the international community's interest. So I do think that will be solved peacefully. And I think that in terms of the situation in Turkey as well, I think if they're not willing to risk these consequences of conflict, both in terms of messing up their own peace process and running into some international sensitivities in Syria, they're going to have to accept, some type of increased political rights participation for Kurds, on both sides of the border. And I think, the ultimate sort of best case scenario for everyone would be seeing this, democratic integration, not as a loss for anyone, but as a win for everyone. One thing that I'll leave is sort of last comment, being in Europe now, if you drive between Belgium and Germany, the only way you know that you've crossed the border is you see the, welcome to Germany sign, and your phone carrier says, okay, you've changed countries. A lot of Kurds that I speak to believe that there's going to be a time when the Syrian-Turkish border looks like that. You'll still have your states, nobody needs to worry about separatism, but it'll be as easy to cross as these EU borders. The communities on both sides will reconnect. You'll be looking at investment. The future is opportunity, I think, if these agreements work out. And I believe that that kind of political and economic opportunity is significant enough that actors are going to think twice before conflict breaks out.
Well, on that very positive note, we'll leave it there, Meghan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your very insightful questions.
Well, that's it for this episode. We have more soon, this time on Armenia's attempts to make peace with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Thanks for tuning in, and goodbye.